Welcome to NAIS Member Voices. I'm Scott Donaldson, Member Engagement Director at the National Association of Independent Schools. This month, we're talking with Tom Woelper, Head of School at Cheshire Academy in Cheshire, Connecticut. Tom, welcome to Member Voices.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. So, I'd love to start with a broad, sweeping topic, and that is leadership. What does leadership mean to you?
Nice starting with a softball question here. When I think about that question, I actually go back to some of the mentors I had. And Malcolm McKenzie was the head at Hotchkiss School when I worked there. And I remember he used this analogy that I thought was a little too clever at first, but in hindsight, I think it's spot on, where he equated leadership to being a conductor in the three senses of that word. You can be a conductor like a choral conductor who's trying to bring together disparate instrument voices to make a beautiful music, to have things sing together as one. You can be a conductor like a train conductor or a bus conductor who needs to collect tickets and make sure everyone is accountable for being where they should be at the right time. And a conductor as in conducting electricity, trying to bring sparkle and life to an institution. So that analogy has resonated with me. I think it speaks a lot about what kind of leadership is all about.
I really like that. Is there one type of conductor that you feel is more natural for you if you were to define yourself or describe how you see yourself as a leader?
Sure. I think also maybe to expand, and I think it's probably a bit of the conductor of an orchestra piece. And I think there is so much to leadership where some things as simple as doing what you're saying you're going to do, knowing when to lead from the front or when to lead from the back. That notion of kind of servant leadership, of really giving yourself to the kind of mission or to the kind of orchestral piece, if you will. One who can really articulate a vision and a direction where a school is going, right? Any conductor is going to interpret a piece of music and how they want it to come together.
Hmm.
So I think that out of those three, that's the one that resonates most naturally with me and how I try to go about my leadership at Cheshire Academy.
And you've been at Cheshire Academy since 2025, but ahead since 2014. Do I have that right?
That's right.
Okay. Now, in what would be, I guess, if I'm doing math, the 12th year of
Yep.
being ahead, what do you feel like you wish you knew when you started that you know now?
That's a great question. And it is interesting how, as I settle into my role here, I think often about what my younger self might have struggled with more than my older self doesn't. And I think recognizing that so much about running a school and leadership is dealing with the kind of ambiguity of things. I went to teachers college and got my master's through the Claystein Center. I remember all the case studies that we did there, and things are seldom as neat and clean in the decision making that one needs to make. And I sometimes find I need to make the least worst decision in a case instead of something that necessarily is win-win for everybody, though those cases exist there too. So I'd say to understand and appreciate there's going to be a lot of ambiguity, that it's sometimes I would want to get more information or more feedback from many people. And at some point, you have to take in enough information and make a decision and move forward. And so much is about the communication of what you do. And as I said before, I think so much doing what you say you're going to do matters as a leader. Being honest, often when you have to say that, will work to be as transparent as I can in any situation, but there are often situations that require a lot of confidentiality and privacy, and how it's important to build up the trust with your colleagues when you get to those different spaces. Myself now looking back, again, there's a lot of ambiguity. There's lots of things that don't have clean, easy decisions, and you have to be comfortable navigating in that space, I think is the advice I would give my younger self.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, we might have touched on it a little bit in the how you view yourself as a leadership question, but do you have a certain communication style or approach when it comes to communicating with your different constituents? And I imagine it might differ too, depending on whether it's, students, staff, or parents.
I think one mistake I may have made earlier there is thinking that just because you say it once or write it once means that everybody understood it and has internalized it. And so, if anything, recognizing that you often have to kind of repeat yourself in different ways over time, and often through different kind of mediums. So, if anything, depending on what you want to say, I realize sometimes it's good to broaden the circle who learns a direction or a decision you want to make, a way to get feedback, to get some people who can be allies in that a decision in the know sooner, getting feedback for how they anticipate others might receive some news that, again, might be a different direction or not what they were expecting. So you have really seeded the ground before you get to the point when you have to communicate about something that is of more consequence later. So I've been a bit more strategic sometimes too in how I communicate bigger decisions.
Hmm, that makes sense. Another softball question. If you could name it, what is your biggest challenge right now? What keeps you up at night?
Well, I think what I'm going to say may not be news for many in the school business. It's about the whole financial sustainability of our schools in general. We can look at macro trends out there from demographic cliffs to disruptive nature of AI to, we rely on international students to come here. So changing immigration policies, a war and the uncertainty in the economy, you know, already makes what's a delicate balancing act for many schools an even more delicate balancing act. Many will have seen the news that Hampshire College, closed kind of several weeks ago, and that becomes certainly something that makes us all nervous. So, always looking at operating in a fiscally responsible way, but also making sure that we deliver on the educational experience that our families want, from net tuition dollars to financial aid budgets to annual fund and kind of fundraising. Finding that right balance and remembering that I got into this business because I love working with kids. I love being in kind of schools and finding space to focus on the things that drew me into this in the first place. So, financial health.
Yeah, and did you have experience with finances prior to becoming a head? I know we've heard in some of our work at NAIS that many heads don't necessarily have that financial experience when they become a head, that financial background because they're coming from the classroom. What was your story?
I was that kind of story. I began as a history teacher and a soccer lacrosse coach, a dorm parent and advisor, and kind of grew through the administrative ranks by becoming a class dean and then on the journey to becoming a head of school. I think I might have been in the first or second cohort of the NAS Aspiring Heads kind of program all those years ago. As I mentioned, went to kind of teachers college, which gives you some of that academic understanding, which kind of clearly is valuable. But so much of it is even more than just being able to work with a spreadsheet. And any good CFO or treasurer from a board can be helpful navigating that. But so much is often, again, the values that go kind of beneath the dollars. If you have these different trade offs that you need to kind of make, and being able to articulate what is most important and what needs the various dollars, and understanding too things you don't get. It's easy to neglect the deferred maintenance of a campus, right? Because that's money you might be setting aside in your Prism account that might be for paving a road or putting on a new roof some years in the future. And yet, if you aren't paying attention to all of that and giving that equal value, then you find yourself in some real trouble. So again, I'm using some of that language and stuff that I learned. I was coming a kind of head of school, thinking about deferred maintenance and kind of Prism accounts. But there is some part where, if you come from the academic background, you probably don't fully get that experience until you are in this seat. Though back, as I said, so much is just being clear on the kind of priorities of the institution and your values to make sure that's reflected in your budget and how you spend your money.
Where were you before getting the head of school role at Cheshire Academy?
Yeah, I've had a really kind of interesting journey. So before here, I was the founding head of a startup school focused on innovation and entrepreneurship in Marlborough, Mass, New England Innovation Academy. There's an interesting story what drew me there. And then I was the head of Fargo's Country Day School, a pre-K through 8 school was my kind of first headship. And then before that, I was back in the prep school world. I was assistant head of school, dean of academic life at Hotchkiss School, and then all the way back to my roots here, having worked at Taft School and Groton School. So very much a kind of boarding school person in most of my professional career.
Yeah, kind of working backwards. How did you, well, I guess this would be a question for several different stops you made along the way, but adjusting and acclimating to a new school's culture, specifically as a head of school, how do you approach that?
The fact that I worked at some different schools, I was a student at kind of Lawrenceville School, so understood some of the boarding school world. In fact, that's probably why I'm sitting in this chair now. That experience was so transformative for me. And having worked at Groton and then Taft for 9 years, I was the head of a small international school in Chiang Mai, Thailand for a year, a whole different story. 14 years at Hotchkiss, at the head of a pre-K through 8 school at Forest Country Day School, and then a startup. By virtue of having worked at some different schools, I think I quickly learned or escaped any trap of trying to make the new school I went to into the school where I was previously. And I think that's easy, especially if you've been someplace for a long time. It's easy to internalize that culture, the way things are done there, and realize that that doesn't always translate to a different school, a different culture, and that there are different ways to do things. And so I think the fact that I've worked at some different schools has helped me approach new opportunities, not through the lens of trying to make this school that kind of previous school, and really working hard to deeply understand the mission, the culture, the values, what makes sense in that school context, while also not simply just giving in to say it has to always be a certain way at that school, because there are different ways of doing things. There are things that can challenge given assumptions that can be really healthy for a school. So, in some ways, the fact I've had the opportunity to work at some different schools has made it easier for me not to try to make a, a new school into one of my previous ones.
Yeah, sure. I wanted to drill down a bit into working at a boarding school. Cheshire is boarding day, is that right?
That's right. We were at 50-50 day and boarding. And just to give a quick background, Cheshire Academy was founded in 1794, one of the oldest schools in the country. As I say, back when George Washington started his second term, founded by Samuel Seabury, the first Episcopal bishop of North America, made famous again by kind of Hamilton, has a little cameo there. Again, was founded as the Episcopal Academy, became a military school during the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln, Secretary of Navy, Samuel Seabury went here, was co-ed at some point in the 19th century, admitted his first international student in the 1840s, a student from Cuba, probably coming up here because he made cigars to get the tobacco wrappers that are famous in the Connecticut River Valley. Changed names to the Roxbury School when it was really trying to be a tutorial school based on the Oxford model of tutorial to prep boys to go to Yale at that point, and then kind of Cheshire Academy in its modern kind of incarnation, coming out of the Second World War. It's been a K-12 school, a 7 through 12 school, but it's been a kind of boarding school through much of that, though always somewhere being a day boarding school. And we're right now about 50% day, 50% boarding. The history of this school is so wrapped into the history of the town of Cheshire. So just really fascinating kind of history to the school. My long-winded way back to, yes, we are about 50% day, 50% boarding. About half of our boarding students are international students, which has long been part of the school's history too, not just back to the Cuban student that came in the 1840s, but even that in the 1850s, as I talk to alums, they speak about the students from Central and South America in particular at that time. So part of the school's DNA and history.
Yeah, no, I love hearing that. A few pieces that I'd like to drill down on there. So, can you talk about the unique character of a boarding school or a school that is boarding day 50-50 or close to it?
Yeah, it is really interesting that it presents fascinating opportunities and also challenges. I think NIS and its Dazzle platform might ask a school to define itself as a boarding day or day boarding school. If you're boarding day, I think the guideline is you have 60% or more boarding students. If you're a day boarding school, you have 60% or more day students. And in some ways, we're right in the middle, neither fish nor fowl in those two models. And it presents both, opportunities and some challenges, some kind of friction. And the friction in terms of what defines your school culture. Is it a day school culture or a kind of residential boarding school culture? And we certainly lean into the kind of latter. So much of our school is built around the residential programming and the weekend activities where we look to bring day students, back onto campus to be part of that, but also gives remarkable opportunities for the boarding students to build friendships and relationships with our day students and often to become extensions of their families as they have opportunities to spend weekends or kind of spend time with them, or even often over the different school breaks and kind of holidays. So you do in some ways get the best of both those worlds, but it's always some work to navigate the different dynamics about a school that is overwhelmingly boarding or a school that's clearly a day school.
That's helpful. And also the international student piece, would love to hear more about that dynamic and if there have been any challenges recently in having international students come to the school.
Sure. Yeah, I kind of mentioned it's been fascinating as I've gone out to talk to alums as early as the 1950s, including a fun sidebar. My sister's father-in-law and twin brother, I learned after I got the job, went to Cheshire Academy. They were day students in the 1950s, and it's helped me create a wonderful kind of relationship with my sister's father-in-law. And as he tells all these stories about some things that I continue to see and recognize at the school now, and some things that have changed over the 60 years since he's been enrolled here. But he talked a lot about the international students, some best friends from Cuba and Venezuela at that point in time, and spoke then about how the different perspective, the different culture, the opportunity for Cheshire students who made friends to go visit them in their home country was one of the defining features of his experience here. And so, as I said, looking back to our first international students in the 1840s, I'm struck by things that become through lines in schools that have been around for a long time. And some of where the international students have come from have changed over time with the market being different. I was just at an event with alums in New York City, and they were from the early 1980s, and they talked about a lot of students from Iran and the Middle East were the ones that they kind of remembered. And Cheshire, like many schools, at some point also had a number of students from kind of Korea, and we have probably more students now from kind of China, and some of that has shifted. You're always looking to diversify the mix of students from any part of the world because geopolitics can change and can make it more difficult for students from some part of the world to come than others. And so we're looking at both being as intentional as we can to diversify that mix, both for the student experience here, but also for the fiscal responsibility you want to have in case one of those markets suddenly finds it more difficult to send students than another one. And kind of quickly, we fortunately have not had any significant problems with students getting visas, which I know has been a pregnant topic out there, wondering if and where that might be the case, even though I think more the issue are international students who don't want to risk going through the process and finding they don't have a spot here and looking elsewhere, I think is something that we're not alone in terms of grappling with. But we have found those international students both have brought so much to our culture and campus, in some ways providing our domestic students with some sort of international context and experience they may not otherwise get. It's part of the factor for us becoming an IB school, I think was also kind of connected with that. And then we also work to get our students out into the world also. But it really has, over and over, talking to our alums and to our students, just how much they value having the diversity of kind of perspective, culture, and wonderful when you see kids sitting in the dining room from all around the world, at a lunch table, swapping stories and building friendships, things that, carry on far past their time here, to the point that my, sister's father-in-law, talks so fondly about, his international friends when he graduated in 1956.
Yeah, right. Yeah, what an obviously powerful and memorable experience for them and for the students. That's great. So we've talked about the, boarding day and talked about the international students. Now I want to focus on the high school. So you serve students 9 through postgraduate. Do I have that correct as well?
That's right.
Okay. Can you talk about how your school, it sounds like it's been through several iterations of different grades that it's catered to, but now focusing specifically and exclusively on high school students, how you approach supporting students through the high school experience?
I think many schools might talk about meeting students where they are and taking them beyond where they thought was possible. And I really think that is something special about Cheshire Academy. And we do that in a number of different ways that I think some are kind of unique to us. First, there genuinely is not a single pathway through here. Beginning in grade 9, we have different options for students to take different history classes and English classes, which often there's a freshman English 101 or history 101, and you might place in different levels of math or language. But we also, even in kind of science, have some different options. So it's really possible for students in partnership with their advisors or with our college office to start crafting a course of study that really matches some of their interests and their passions. Can go a pathway where they're either a full IB student, you have an arts major, which is a possibility, or can put together a kind of a la carte program that matches some of their needs. We also have a distinctive program called our Roxbury Center for Learning and Leadership, and it just celebrated its 25th anniversary last year. And at its inception, it was not like what kind of many schools have, a program that provides academic support for its kind of students, helps us kind of support a broader neurodiversity in our student body, students who are bright and talented in so many ways, but need some of the one-on-one kind of coaching model that's at the heart of that program. And we've just launched or launching for next year a way to kind of broaden that kind of coaching model to having pathways, tracks for students who might be scholar athletes and want to navigate the pressure and challenges of kind of performing at a high level and wanting to be a college athlete, needing the academic support or student leadership, or some students who might need more intensive kind of ESL work. So, as a school that meets students where they are and takes them beyond where they thought they were going, we kind of really live that in many different ways in terms of the kind of curriculum as well as our Roxbury program. And we see it in a really powerful way in outcomes. We take great pride in this. We've got 100 seniors, 15 postgraduates. And this year, last year, and I think it's been this way for a number of years, they're going to 80 different colleges. That's really something wonderful here that I think speaks to the individualized and personalized pathways, and it shows up in the diversity of colleges that our students go to.
Yeah, I love hearing all of that. And I guess to broaden out just one step further, I would love to hear from you, as I love to hear from many of our guests, about what you feel is the unique value of a private or independent school education.
I think it starts with something that almost is self-evident for independent school people, is that we are mission-driven institutions, right? It's not some state mandate or the Board of Education telling us what we need to do. And in the end, how we can live more fully into our mission and always keep the experience of the students first and foremost is something I think independent schools writ large do incredibly well. It's what really attracts and keeps me here in this work. And so we can have a school that can focus on the arts, or it can be a school on innovation and entrepreneurship, or it can be a school that looks to develop the whole person, or a church based school. And all of those can resonate with different families in the marketplace. So, again, the mission driven nature of our institutions is what I think is really kind of special about Cheshire Academy and independent schools in general.
Yeah, I agree. Well, a less empowering question or topic, but we talked about challenges that you all are facing right now, and that really schools, independent schools across the nation are facing right now. Another is polarization, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about if you've encountered that in your school community, and how you navigate leading a school during a time where there's such intense polarization in many cases.
Kind of fortunately, in my time here so far, it's not roiled our campus as much as I think it has others. And some of that, I think, has been that one signature part of Cheshire is that we are an incredibly diverse school community, both in terms of race and ethnicity and religion and visible markers of diversity, but also in some of the less kind of visible areas, some of the neurodiversity that we have or the socioeconomic diversity that we have. And so, in some ways, because we are diverse, there's not it diminishes some of the haves, have nots, or those who might be the larger population within your school that seems to be more dominant and the one that others need to kind of respond to. So I think that's been helpful. We also, and maybe this is like many schools, we've tried to center so much of our school around our values, and belonging is our first value, and talk a lot about how you need to be in a place where you can authentically and fully be who you are without having to try to conform or put on airs in order to feel like you belong. And certainly for us to do the work we want to do here, that's the space where we need students to move into or be in. And so I think by centering so much of this on our values instead of getting caught up in kind of jargon or semantics about DEI or being too woke or too that has also been helpful by, again, grounding it in what's been part of Cheshire Academy values for a long time, that deep sense of belonging. And we talk about our other values. If you belong, then you can engage. If you can belong, engage, then you can collaborate. If you belong, engage, and collaborate, then you can grow. And so I think that's what's helped us. That, as I said, we haven't been roiled as much as by other schools. And I think by constantly coming back to our mission and our values, we've been able to avoid some of the politicization of DEI work that's been out there without losing track of what we've always found to be powerful and important, which I think has often been the goal of a lot of DEI work to begin with. Many schools talk about DEI B with belonging as a place where you want to move to in that work.
Yeah, I'd love to kind of follow this thread a bit more and learn more about what you do or where you turn to for inspiration during hard or confusing times or rough days. How do you get inspired? How do you keep going?
It's funny, when I was the head of a pre-K through 8 school and having a rough day, I go straight to pre-K or kindergarten always, to go in to read a story to the kids, to be back to ones who make you feel like a rock star when you would walk through the door because they'd be so happy to kind of see you, to show you their artwork and what they were working on. But by extension, it's always being with the kids, going out and watching a game, sitting down and having a conversation over a lunch table, popping into a classroom and seeing what they're doing. And it always comes back to the kind of students, and the student experience is where I recharge, and the kind of the inspiration to help me continue to do what I want to do. But also always, have trusted mentors who I can turn to. I work close with a man named Ross Peters, who's worked with Expo Elevate. I know he was on the NAS board for a period of time. He is someone who is, a trusted friend, mentor, counsel, so I can go and just speak candidly about the day and the hard things that I'm going through, and have someone who listens well and asks good questions. And I have some board members who can do the same thing. I can say, this is what I'm kind of grappling with. So I think that combination of always going back to the kids are the ones who inspire me and recharge my battery and remind me of why I do what I do. And then having some of those kind of trusted friends, mentors to reach out to as well.
That's great. Yep. If you think of it like Family Feud style, those are definitely maybe the number one and the number two answers. So I'm happy to hear that. Yep. And related to mentors, some questions building off of that. Are there specific pieces of advice that you've received in your professional journey or even in your personal life that relate that you can share that have really stuck with you and made an impact?
Gosh, it's funny as you start to say that. And I mentioned earlier, I'm likely doing this work because of how profound my experience at Lawrenceville School was. And there, my history teacher was my house master, to use the Lawrenceville language, for a dorm parent, effectively my advisor, next to my parents and a few others, is probably the most influential person in my life. And I remember, like many high school kids, making some mistakes. And in so many words, taught me is that you hate the sin, but you love the sinner type of concept. And that's something that I've certainly, taken on in my work as a school person, as a school head. When I talk to kids or colleagues sometimes who might fall short, is to really separate out maybe some of the actions or things that don't meet it with our values or our handbook or the way that we want to live, but always coming back and kind of loving the person, loving the kid, loving the adult, And, that type of empathy and understanding, not that he said those words exactly, but certainly a lesson that I learned has been one that I've kind of taken with me and try to live by.
That's great. And as you were mentioning Lawrenceville, I also was reminded that I wanted to ask you about being, I think you said founding head, right, in your last
Yeah.
role. Yeah, what was that experience like being a founding head? That must have been intimidating, exciting, probably lots of emotions.
I think in some ways I'm glad I didn't know then what I know now. I may not have gone in and done it. But again, can also talk about mentors. When I was at Hotchkiss, Skip Mattoon was head of school when I started there. He went on to be one of the co-founding heads of Avenue School. And Malcolm McKenzie went on to be the founding head of Keystone Academy in Beijing. So I had some role models and mentors who had gone off and done that. And that thought of who gets to be a founding head of school anymore? I mean, Cheshire was founded in 1794. You don't have that opportunity. And so when that chance came up and really excited about the school focusing on innovation and entrepreneurship, I laughed that I feel this way in schools in general, but the school time paradox where the days last forever, but the weeks and the months can fly by. And at the same time, every week there felt like a month. So though I was there for 5 years, it felt like I was there for a lot longer because when you are translating things from concept and vision, which it was in what I call year zero with me and the board and a handful of others, to having to hire the entire faculty, work with them to write the curriculum, write the handbook and the policies, and to translate a vision into practice and to recruit students. I mean, every step along the way, all coming out of COVID, right? It seems insane in hindsight that even attempted to do that. And yet, some of the takeaways having more of an entrepreneur's mindset. I think at schools sometimes, and I think COVID showed us this too, that you can pivot and adapt far more quickly than you ever thought you could do. And schools often like to be really deliberate and planful about adapting and changing. And if anything, I learned as part of a startup school is that you can pivot and adapt far more quickly than you might think you can. You've got to identify the challenge or the opportunity. You've got to articulate clearly why you need to do that. And then you put the resources and you can act on that. And so that was certainly one of the territories. And also needing to multitask and deal with kind of ambiguity. Something I said at the beginning, something that I've kind of learned is that there's so much uncertainty as part of a startup enterprise, so much ambiguity, so much need to adapt and kind of pivot, that it's really become something that I've internalized into who I am. I've always been a pretty even tempered, even keeled person. And now there's almost nothing someone can say or do that kind of knocks me off of dead center. I think I've realized in hindsight so much of what people see as a crisis really isn't a crisis. It's about kind of communication and taking the steps you have to take. I mean, you can have a real crisis, right? You can have a fire in a building, which we had last year on our campus, which fortunately everybody was safe. But then I was quickly able to move into a space where it's about the kind of communication and the next steps is so important. I feel like I learned some of that dealing with the uncertainties and the zigs and zags as being part of a startup school and bring it into my work now.
Yeah, yeah, what an impactful experience that sounds like it was, and just to have that trait as a head of school too, to be fairly unflappable, right, with everything that changes and comes your way. That's great. Is there anything, at NAIS, and a lot of our members were active readers and podcast listeners, and is there anything that you've read or watched or listened to lately that you feel like has really helped you grow as a leader, helped you in your role?
Yeah, I always like to read, and I love the newsletter that kind of Deborah sends out to heads of school that have a bunch of embedded links. I read the Educator's Notebook is something that comes out on kind of Sundays, and so I end up reading lots of those different articles. And it's tough for me to pick any given one. I've been fascinated by AI and the disruptions there. And so lots of articles, podcasts, books about that. One thing I have had our faculty read, and I've done some work with the Center for Transformative Teaching and Learning before, is kind of NeuroTeach and the Science of Learning is a book I've had some previous faculties read that we're reading here. And I continue to find kind of neuroscience as being fascinating too, how every educator should be expert on how the brain learns. And In some ways, it's surprising that that hasn't been a requirement expectation for everyone in our profession. So I'd say thinking about doing some professional development with AI this year and also with kind of neuroscience. So those are the things that have been first and foremost on my mind.
Yeah, let's maybe talk about AI for just a moment. I mean, we could do a whole another podcast on that and your thoughts and experience with that. But if you could summarize a bit, how do you all approach it at your school and how do you feel about it personally? I know that's another big question, but
Before I started here, give lots of credit to the team here thinking about AI on the level of having clear policies about when and where it could be used, the kind of green light, yellow light, kind of red light policy. So the students had some understandings. Either it couldn't be used or it could be used completely, trying to just navigate the issues of kind of academic integrity, which is where I think a lot of us began with, was really worrying about academic integrity. But I think we've moved away from that. And in some ways, this is here and is already changing the world and we part of the workplace where we still have to think about that. It's not the beginning and end of the conversation. I sort of think one thing that's been so disruptive and different about AI than some other technologies is that at the core, it gets at the question of what does it mean to be human in a way that other things don't. So it has a certain existential overlay to it. And I think for educators, it really forces you to think about what is it that you're really trying to teach. As a head of a pre-K through 8 school, I had a parent who was frustrated that their child had gotten the right answer on a math problem, but was also asked to do the estimate of that problem and got the estimate wrong. And was like, well, why should my child lose points if they got the problem right, but the estimate wrong? And I didn't say it in the moment, but afterwards, I realized, well, actually, the estimate is the more important math quantitative reasoning skill than solving the problem. We'll have a phone in our pocket, can punch in things to a calculator or to an AI agent. But you can't estimate and have some sense, the ability to reason in a quantitative sense to know if the answer is wrong, then in some ways, the fact that you can calculate things kind of correctly misses the point that math is about quantitative reasoning and how you can apply that beyond just getting a math problem right. And to extend that, I think in some ways, AI is challenging us to think what is it? What does it mean to truly be well educated? What is it? What do we really have to learn and understand how to do? And read articles and think that, maybe judgment becomes the more prized mindset skill set to develop than even critical thinking, because you have to exercise judgment with these tools in a way that has not been the priority, perhaps in education previously, right? Learning how to write a really good prompt, right, is suddenly a new skill where you really have to understand what you want to write a really sophisticated prompt to get the best product. I'm old enough that I used to diagram sentences to learn my grammar. And I actually learned my grammar really well with diagramming sentences. But I remember when I first started to use Grammarly as a plugin, Grammarly doesn't always give you the right advice to kind of correct your grammar. But because I know my grammar pretty well, I knew when to accept the recommendations and when not to. And I've treated that in some ways as my kind of metaphor for how I wonder about how we should use AI and these tools going forward. In some ways, if a child can demonstrate they understand grammar at a certain level, then I'd say use Grammarly in everything, right? Because why should you write an essay with any spelling and grammar errors if you have a tool that can help you make sure that you don't do that? But you have to understand enough grammar to understand whether it's right or it's wrong before you get the privilege of then using that tool instead of being lazy and just using it without having actually learned what the grammar is. And I think that's part of what I think some about these AI tools. Are there ways in which we can have students develop the threshold competencies in the different areas where they might use those tools? And then you can use those tools to expect even deeper thinking, different outcomes and kind of products that go far beyond what we'd asked them kind of before. And then we can grapple with how you show your work in terms of what you've done in partnership with AI and what you haven't.
yeah. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. I have other questions, but I'm going to restrain myself for the sake of time. I'd love to we covered a lot of ground in our conversation and lots of big questions throughout this conversation, but I did want to end on a question. What is your greatest achievement? If you had to look back at your career, what are you most proud of?
Oh, goodness. I'll start back as a teacher when you help a student find their way, students who might otherwise thought that they weren't going to make it through or had made a mistake or didn't have confidence. And you're that trusted adult, that mentor who makes a difference in the trajectory of their life. In some ways, it always goes back to the students and those instances where I've had the kind of privilege to be part of that journey, to have a student think they were one thing and then to find some new passions and go in a different direction. And I think my answer always is something along those lines, even as it gets larger, when you're kind of head of school and you think about a strategic plan for an institution or the direction you want to go. It's always about reaching the students, providing them with opportunities to learn and grow in ways that they may not have thought was possible. And so I think my answer always comes back to that. I can talk about being a founding head of school and being challenging and incredibly rewarding to have something that was a concept to the school that got accredited and graduated is first class, right? There's a huge sense of accomplishment and achievement there to, making some difficult kind of decisions I had to one point with the school that had to kind of right size to help it be on a financially kind of secure path and to have a structure that helped it weather the post 2008 demographic blip. I'm really proud of that, though. That doesn't show up in quite the same way because it probably received more criticism in the moment than understanding that it was things that needed to be done from that business side of things of the school. And maybe my last thing, and I talk about schools are funny businesses, they're part family and part business. And if you operate too much like a family, you get into business difficulty, too much like a business, you lose the heart and soul, what makes a school special. And you're always trying to find that healthy balance and tension between those two. So I guess at a high level, when we can strike that right balance between those two, and they aren't always compatible, then those are the things that I take the most pride in.
Well, Tom, it's been a real pleasure speaking with you today. I really appreciate the time and all you've done for the independent school community. So thank you.
And I thank you, Scott. I've enjoyed our conversation as well.
Thanks for listening to NAIS Member Voices. You can find some related NAIS resources from this episode by visiting nais.org/member voices. You can also keep an eye on that page for information about past and upcoming episodes. Please be sure to subscribe to Member Voices wherever you get your podcasts so that you don't miss an episode. And go back and listen to previous episodes you might have missed. If you have feedback for us, please leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform to let us know how we're doing. You can also send your thoughts and suggestions on what you'd like to hear on a future podcast by emailing membership@nais.org.